There is a particular kind of pain that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. Not the pain of physical injury or the pain of obvious loss, though those are real, and those deserve their own acknowledgement, but a subtler and in some ways more persistent pain. The pain of being affected by what other people do and say and think and feel about you in ways that seem entirely outside your control. The pain of a carelessly delivered comment that stays with you for days. The pain of a relationship that ends and leaves behind a quality of emptiness that seems disproportionate to what was actually lost. The pain of rejection, of misunderstanding, of being seen incorrectly or not seen at all. The pain of caring what happens and then having something happen that you did not want. Most strategies for managing this pain are, at their core, strategies of avoidance. Care less, expect less, invest less. Keep people at a distance that prevents them from getting close enough to cause the kind of hurt that proximity makes possible. Build walls, develop detachment, cultivate the manner of a person who is genuinely above being affected by what the world does. The promise of these strategies is a life of reduced vulnerability and therefore reduced pain. What they actually deliver, more often than not, is a life of reduced aliveness. A life that is protected from pain by being simultaneously protected from everything else that contact with the world and with other people makes available. Carl Jung rejected this approach entirely, not because he was naive about the reality of human pain, not because he believed that if you simply think correctly about your experiences they will stop hurting, but because he understood something about the nature of psychological suffering that the avoidance strategies fundamentally miss. The suffering that comes from being hurt by the world, by other people, by circumstances outside your control, is not primarily caused by what happens to you. It is caused by the relationship your inner life has with what happens to you, and that relationship, unlike the events themselves, is something you can genuinely work with, something you can genuinely change, not by becoming less affected, not by caring less, not by building more effective walls, but by developing an inner life solid enough, rooted enough, genuinely enough your own, that what comes from outside can no longer reach the deepest layer of who you are. This is what the title of this video is pointing toward. Not a promise that the world will stop being difficult, not a claim that other people will become kinder or more careful or more consistently aware of the effect they have on you, but an invitation to understand what it would actually mean to arrive at a place in your own psychological development where nothing and nobody can hurt you in the way they once did, where the pain that does occur, and pain will occur, no longer has the power to reach your center, no longer has the power to shake your sense of who you are and what your life means and whether you are worth something and where you belong. Number 1. Why pain reaches us and what it is actually reaching. The first thing that needs to be understood about the kind of hurt this video is addressing is what makes it possible. Why certain things cause pain that seems out of proportion to what happened. Why a casual remark from someone whose opinion you do not consciously value can stay with you for days in a way that a deliberately kind comment from someone you love does not. Why certain kinds of rejection or misunderstanding or dismissal hid in a place that feels much deeper and much more personal than the surface-level event seems to warrant. Jung's answer to this question is one of the most precise and most practically useful ideas in his entire body of work. He observed that the things that hurt us most deeply are almost never hurting us at the surface level where they appear to occur. They are hurting us at the level of an unhealed wound that already existed before the event. The event does not create the wound. The event finds the wound. It lands on a place in the psyche that is already tender, already vulnerable, already carrying a belief or a fear or an unresolved question about the self that makes it unable to receive what happens neutrally. Jung called this the complex. A constellation of emotionally charged material in the unconscious, typically formed around an early and significant experience of pain, rejection, failure, or inadequacy, that retains an autonomous energy long after the original event that created it has passed. When something in the present environment activates the complex, when a current event shares enough structural similarity with the original wound to trigger the same psychic charge, the person does not experience only what is happening now. They experience what is happening now plus the full emotional weight of everything the complex has been carrying, often for years or decades. This is why the pain seems disproportionate. It is disproportionate. It is not only responding to what just happened, it is responding to everything the psyche has been holding in that particular place since the original wound was formed. The present event is merely the match. The complex is the fuel that was already there, waiting. Understanding this does not immediately stop the pain, but it changes the relationship to the pain in a way that is genuinely important. Because if the pain is primarily coming from the complex rather than from the current event, then working with the complex, developing the kind of relationship with your own inner material that Jung called individuation, is the path toward genuine reduction of the pain. Not because the world becomes less challenging, but because the wound that the world is activating gradually heals. And a healed wound, touched by the same kind of event, does not produce the same kind of pain. Number 2, the wound that makes you vulnerable and how it was formed. Every person who lives with a persistent and disproportionate sensitivity to certain kinds of hurt carries within them a wound that was formed at a specific and usually early moment in the developmental history of the self. Jung was not primarily interested in identifying and cataloguing these wounds in the way that some later therapeutic traditions became, because he understood that the goal was not to explain the wound but to integrate it. But he was deeply interested in the mechanism by which early experiences create the kind of psychic material that continues to be activated, often for an entire lifetime, by circumstances that share its structural signature. The wound is almost always formed in the context of a relationship, of an encounter with another person or with the environment in which the early self was developing, in which something of fundamental importance to that self was not adequately recognized, met, or protected. The child who was consistently made to feel that their needs were too much. The young person whose natural expression of who they were was met with contempt or dismissal, or something that communicated clearly that who they were was not acceptable in the form it naturally took. The person who learned, very early and very thoroughly, that they were loved conditionally, that the love and the belonging they needed depended on being a certain way rather than on simply being who they were. These are not exotic or unusual experiences. They are, in various forms and degrees of severity, extraordinarily common, which is precisely why the vulnerability to a certain kind of hurt is so widespread. Almost everyone is carrying one of these wounds, and almost everyone has developed, around it, a particular sensitivity that the world consistently activates. The wound creates its belief. A belief about the self that is held in the unconscious rather than consciously articulated, but that operates nonetheless as a filter through which all subsequent experience is interpreted. I am too much, I am not enough. I am fundamentally unlovable. I am acceptable only when I perform correctly. I am safe only when I make myself small. These beliefs are not reasonable conclusions arrived at through reflection. They are the psyche's early attempt to make sense of experiences that were genuinely painful and genuinely confusing, formed by a self that did not yet have the psychological resources to process them in a more nuanced way, and they persist. Not because the person is unintelligent or uninsightful or unwilling to change, but because the unconscious does not update its beliefs through intellectual argument. It updates them through genuine emotional experience, through encounters with reality that are strong enough and sustained enough to actually create new psychic material capable of counterbalancing what the wound established. This is why knowing that you are not too much, intellectually knowing it, being told by everyone around you that you are not too much, does not stop the pain when something in the world activates the belief that you are. The belief is not held at the level where intellectual knowing reaches. Number 3. What the shadow has to do with being hurt. One of Jung's most important and most counterintuitive observations about the psychology of pain is the role that what he called the shadow plays in making us vulnerable to certain kinds of hurt. The shadow is the repository of everything the conscious ego has decided it cannot be, everything that was judged unacceptable, weak, inadequate, wrong, or dangerous about the self in its natural form, and that was therefore pushed into the unconscious in order to preserve the acceptability of the conscious presentation. The shadow is not what was done to you. It is what you decided you could not afford to be as a result of what was done to you or what you observed the world responding to in ways that felt threatening. The child who was punished for anger learns not to be angry, or rather learns not to consciously be angry. The anger does not disappear, it goes into the shadow. The young person who was shamed for vulnerability learns not to be vulnerable in the visible sense. The vulnerability does not disappear, it goes into the shadow, and here is the part that connects to being hurt. The things that hurt us most reliably are very often the things that activate our shadow material. The criticism that wounds deeply is almost always criticism that touches something we already secretly believe about ourselves. Something we have been trying not to be, and have been hoping no one would notice we are. The rejection that causes the most pain is almost always a rejection that confirms a fear we carry about our own unworthiness that we have been working very hard to keep out of conscious awareness. This is not a pleasant observation, but it is an enormously freeing one, once you have sat with it long enough to genuinely understand it. Because if what hurts most is what activates the shadow, then integrating the shadow, developing a conscious relationship with what you have been most afraid to acknowledge about yourself, removes the primary mechanism by which the external world is able to cause you the deepest kind of pain. When you have genuinely made peace with your own anger, when you can acknowledge it, feel it, express it appropriately, without it feeling like a catastrophic violation of who you need to be, then someone else's criticism of your anger no longer hits in the same place. When you have genuinely allowed your own vulnerability to be real and present and acknowledged in your own inner life, then someone's dismissal of your vulnerability no longer destroys you from inside. Not because you become indifferent to how you are treated, but because the shadow material that was being activated is no longer entirely in the dark. Number 4, the inner stability that nothing can shake. Jung described the goal of the individuation process with a phrase that is easy to say and genuinely demanding to arrive at. He called it the development of the self as the center of the personality. Not the ego, not the persona, not the adapted social presentation that has been built through years of learning what the world accepts and what it does not. The self, the deeper totality of who you are, including everything conscious and everything that has been made conscious through genuine psychological work, standing as the actual center from which you live. When the self is the center, when the deepest layer of who you are is not the wound and not the complex and not the fear and not the adopted belief about your own inadequacy, but something more fundamental than any of those, something that was present before the wound and that the wound has been obscuring, something that is genuinely yours and genuinely real and genuinely stable, the relationship to what comes from outside changes in a very specific and very significant way. Things still happen. People still say and do things that are unkind or careless or genuinely wrong. Circumstances still produce difficulty and loss, and the particular pain of not getting what you were hoping for. None of that stops. What stops is the capacity of those events to reach the deepest layer of who you are. They can affect you. They can produce responses in you that are real and that deserve acknowledgement and processing, but they cannot shake the foundation. They cannot reach the place where your sense of yourself actually lives, because that place is no longer determined by what comes from outside. This is not a state of emotional numbness. It is precisely the opposite. The person who has arrived at this kind of inner stability is often more emotionally available than before, not less, because they no longer need to protect themselves from their own emotional responses in the way that the unhealed wound required. They can feel what happens without being destroyed by it. They can be moved without being uprooted. They can be genuinely present to what is difficult, without requiring the difficulty to stop being real in order to remain intact. Number 5, the work of building what cannot be shaken. What is required to build this kind of inner stability is not a technique or a practice in the narrow sense of that word. It is a genuine and sustained engagement with your own psychological life, the kind of engagement that Jung described as the lifelong work of individuation, the work of making conscious what was unconscious, of integrating what was split off, of developing a genuine relationship with the shadow, with the complex, with all of the material that has been operating in the dark, driving responses and creating vulnerabilities. without the conscious mind having any real understanding of where those responses and vulnerabilities were coming from. This work looks different for different people. For some, it happens most naturally in the context of serious psychotherapy, with someone trained in working at this depth. For others, it happens through long and honest engagement with their own dream life, which Jung considered the primary language through which the unconscious communicates with the conscious mind. For others, it happens through creative work, through the kind of genuine artistic engagement that allows the unconscious material to find expression in form. For others, it happens through the practice of genuine solitude, the willingness to sit with one's own experience long enough and honestly enough that the deeper layers begin to become visible. What all of these paths share is the requirement of genuine courage. Not the dramatic courage of facing external danger, but the often more difficult courage of facing what is inside, of being willing to look at the parts of yourself that the persona has decided cannot be looked at, of allowing the shadow to be real rather than continuing to pretend it does not exist, of acknowledging the wound rather than building more sophisticated defenses against its activation. A woman I knew described the process this way. She had spent most of her adult life in what she called a kind of constant vigilance, always monitoring the emotional temperature of the people around her, always adjusting her presentation in response to signals from the environment, always slightly braced for the next thing that would confirm her deepest fear, which was that she was fundamentally too difficult, too intense, too much for the people she cared about. She was not living badly, she was functioning well, but she was exhausted in a very specific way, the exhaustion of someone who is always slightly at war with their own nature. The work she did was not about changing who she was, it was about genuinely meeting who she was, about discovering that the intensity and the depth she carried were not the problem the early environment had suggested they were. About developing, slowly and through real experience rather than intellectual persuasion, a sense of her own nature as something genuinely worth inhabiting rather than something that needed to be managed and contained. As that development proceeded, the vigilance gradually relaxed, not because the people around her changed, or the world became less prone to careless communication, but because the fear that had been driving the vigilance was no longer quite as urgent, because the wound it was protecting was no longer quite as raw. Number 6. When the wound heals, what the world loses its power to do, there is a very specific shift that occurs as the inner work proceeds, as the wound heals and the shadow integrates and the self begins to stand more genuinely as the center of the personality. That is worth describing carefully because it is easy to misunderstand. The shift is not that you stop caring. It is not that other people's actions and words become irrelevant to you. It is not that you develop the kind of detachment that is really just emotional suppression wearing the mask of equanimity. It is something quite different from all of those things. What changes is the depth to which what comes from outside can penetrate. The hurtful comment can still be registered. It can still be responded to, still be communicated about, still be noted as the kind of behavior you do not want to be around. But it no longer reaches the place in you that carries the belief about your own fundamental inadequacy, because that place has been genuinely worked with. The wound that made you vulnerable to that particular form of pain is no longer entirely unhealed, and a wound that is not entirely unhealed cannot be activated with the same intensity by the same kind of touch. Jung described this shift using the language of psychological maturity. The mature psyche, he said, does not require the external world to be other than it is in order to maintain its sense of itself. It does not need other people to be consistently kind or consistently seeing or consistently treating it in ways that confirm its worth, because its sense of its own worth is no longer primarily derived from those external sources. It has developed what Jung called an internal locus of authority, a sense of self that is genuine and stable enough to remain intact even when the world is being difficult or unkind or simply indifferent in the way that the world very frequently is. This does not mean the mature psyche is superior or above ordinary human experience. It means it has less of its own unresolved material, creating the conditions under which ordinary human experience becomes extraordinary pain. The event is the same. The pain is different, not because feeling has been suppressed, but because the wound that was amplifying the pain has been genuinely addressed. Number 7. The life that becomes possible when nothing can truly hurt you. There is a quality of freedom that becomes available to the person who has done enough of this work that the title of this video begins to feel genuinely true in their experience, not as an aspiration, but as a description of how they actually live. Not a perfect or absolute freedom, not a state in which nothing ever stings or nothing ever produces a response that needs attending to, but a freedom from the particular kind of suffering that the unhealed wound and the unintegrated shadow have been generating, often for years or decades. The quality of this freedom is not the freedom of isolation or detachment. It is the freedom of genuine presence, because the person who is not protecting an unhealed wound no longer needs to maintain the kind of vigilance that protection requires. They can be genuinely present to other people without the constant monitoring of whether what is happening might activate the wound. They can receive what comes toward them without the anticipatory bracing. They can be in relationship with the full reality of another person, including the parts that are difficult or imperfect or sometimes careless, without those parts reaching a place that cannot tolerate being touched. This is what genuine relationship looks like when the wound has healed. Not relationship without friction or disappointment, or the ordinary difficulties of two different people trying to be genuinely honest with each other, but relationship in which those difficulties can be met, processed and integrated without producing the kind of collapse or withdrawal or defensive hardening that the unhealed wound required. Relationship in which being hurt is possible but being destroyed is not, in which the pain of genuine contact, and genuine contact always carries some possibility of pain, no longer has to be avoided at the cost of the contact itself. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness he is speaking of is not external. It is the shadow, the wound, the complex, the unacknowledged and unintegrated material of the inner life that has been operating in the dark, determining responses and creating vulnerabilities, without the conscious mind having any real say in the matter. Making that darkness conscious, developing a genuine relationship with it, integrating it into a more complete and more honest sense of who you are, this is the path. Not to a life without pain, but to a life in which the pain that does occur belongs to the real experience of genuine living, rather than to the endless activation of old wounds that were never given the chance to heal. Nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again in the way you have been hurt when the work is genuinely done. Not because the world changes. Because you do. Because the place inside where the hurt has always landed is no longer unprotected in the way it once was, is no longer raw in the way it once was, is no longer waiting to be confirmed in its deepest fear in the way it once was, is gradually and genuinely healed, and a healed place, touched by the same kind of experience that once caused such pain, does not produce the same kind of pain. It produces something different, something that belongs to the full range of human experience rather than to the specific suffering of an inner life that was never given the chance to become whole. If this video touches something in you that you have been carrying for a long time, something about a particular kind of hurt you have never quite been able to protect yourself from, leave a word in the comments. Not an explanation. Just the word that names what you recognized, because naming what has been invisible is where the healing always begins. And if you want to continue this work, the work of becoming someone whose center cannot be shaken by what the world does, stay close to this channel. Not to become invulnerable, but to become genuinely whole. There is something important to add about the specific experience of the person who is in the middle of this process, who has begun the work but has not yet arrived at the place where the title feels genuinely descriptive of their experience. Because the middle of this journey is a particular kind of difficult that the descriptions of the destination can accidentally make worse, if they are not accompanied by an honest account of what the middle actually feels like. The middle feels, for many people, less stable than before the work began, not more stable, because when you start to genuinely look at the wound and the shadow and the complex, when you stop relying on the defenses that have been protecting you from your own inner material, there is a period during which the inner life feels more turbulent, more activated, more present in an uncomfortable way than it did when the defenses were still fully operational. The things that hurt seem to hurt more, not less, because you are actually feeling them now rather than managing them at a distance. This is not a sign that the work is going wrong. It is a sign that it is going right. The pain that increases in this period is not new pain. It is old pain that is finally being given enough space and enough attention to be fully felt rather than partially managed. And pain that is fully felt is, paradoxically, more likely to heal than pain that is consistently half-managed and never fully processed, because healing requires genuine contact with what hurts. It requires the willingness to actually be with the wounded place, rather than to maintain the perpetual vigil of protecting it. The instinct during this period is to return to the defenses, to conclude that the work is making things worse rather than better, that the vulnerability that is emerging is not the path to a healed wound, but simply more vulnerability, more exposure to pain, more risk. This instinct is understandable and it deserves compassion, but it is, in almost every case, a misreading of what is actually happening. What is actually happening is that the psyche, having been given permission at last to engage with what it has been carrying, is beginning to do the work that it has always been oriented toward doing, but that the defenses have been preventing. The process is not comfortable, but it is, in the deepest sense, the right process. The one that leads, not quickly and not in a straight line, but genuinely and finally, toward the kind of inner stability that the defenses were always trying to approximate, but could never actually produce. A man I knew described a period of several months during his work with these ideas in which he felt, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely fragile, easily moved, easily hurt, easily brought to the edge of emotional responses that he had previously been very effective at managing before they could surface. He described this as the most uncomfortable period of his life, and also, in retrospect, as the most important, because what the fragility was revealing was not weakness but presence. He was actually there for what was happening in a way that his previous management of his inner life had never allowed. And from that presence, from the genuine contact with what was real in him, something began to develop that no amount of management could have produced. A stability that was not the absence of feeling, but the capacity to feel without being destroyed by the feeling. This is what Jung meant by the development of the self. Not a self that is protected from experience, but a self that is large enough and real enough and genuinely enough its own to contain experience without being overwhelmed by it. A self that can hold pain without collapsing, that can be moved without being uprooted, that can be in genuine contact with the full range of human experience, including the parts that hurt, without requiring the hurt to stop before it can remain intact. The path to this kind of self runs through the wound, not around it. It runs through the shadow, not away from it. It runs through the complex, not in avoidance of it. And it runs through a quality of honest and sustained attention to your own inner life that the world does not make easy, that the available models of functionings and succeeding often actively discourage. But that is, in the end, the only path that leads to what the title of this video promises, not to a life without pain, but to a life in which the pain that does occur belongs to the real, to the genuine, to the actually lived experience of being fully human, rather than to the endless unnecessary suffering of a wound that was never given the chance to heal. The difference between those two kinds of pain is enormous. The first kind, the pain of genuine living, of loss and difficulty and the ordinary friction of being in contact with a world that does not always meet you where you are, is bearable. It belongs to something real, it carries information, it passes. The second kind, the pain of the activated wound, of the unintegrated shadow, of the complex that keeps finding the same hurt in every new situation that resembles the original one, is the kind of pain that feels like it will never end. Because without the work, it does not end. It simply finds new activations, new situations that confirm the same old belief, new people who inadvertently replay the same old wound. The work breaks that cycle, not completely and not overnight, but genuinely and progressively, in the way that genuine psychological development always proceeds, through effort and setback and gradual accumulation of something real. Until the day comes when you notice, not with fanfare or dramatic announcement but with a quiet surprise, that something that would once have sent you into days of difficult feeling has landed differently this time, has produced a response that is real but not catastrophic, has touched you without penetrating to the deepest layer, has confirmed, gently and unmistakably, that something has genuinely changed in the inner landscape, that the wound is not as raw as it was, that the shadow is not as dark, that the center is a little more solid, a little more genuinely yours, a little more capable of remaining intact in the face of what the world sends toward it. That is the journey Jung was describing, and the destination, imperfect and ongoing and never entirely complete, is what the title of this video is pointing toward. The life in which nothing and nobody can hurt you in the way they once did, because the place they were always reaching has finally, through your own genuine and sustained effort, begun to heal. There is one final dimension of this exploration that deserves direct attention, because it addresses a question that arises almost inevitably when this kind of inner work is described. The question is whether the goal of not being hurt, of developing the kind of inner stability that cannot be shaken by what comes from outside, is compatible with genuine love and genuine connection. Whether the path toward becoming unhurtable is also, inevitably, a path toward becoming less fully engaged with the people and the world you care about. Jung's answer to this question is unambiguous, and it is one of the most important things he had to say on the entire subject. The path toward genuine inner stability is not a path away from connection. It is the path toward connection that is more genuinely available, more genuinely mutual, more genuinely real than what was possible before. Because the person who is protecting an unhealed wound cannot be fully present in relationship. They are always partially managing the wound, always partially positioned so as to minimize the risk of activation, always bringing to the relationship a portion of their attention and energy that is not available for genuine contact because it is occupied with protection. When the wound heals, that portion of attention and energy becomes available. The person can be actually present in a way that the protected person cannot. They can be genuinely moved by what moves the other person, genuinely delighted by what delights them, genuinely hurt in the appropriate and proportionate way by what hurts them, without that appropriate and proportionate hurt triggering the deeper wound that once turned ordinary friction into what felt like catastrophe. This is the paradox at the heart of Jung's understanding of psychological development. The path toward being less hurt does not lead away from feeling. It leads toward feeling more accurately and more fully, because the distortion that the wound and the shadow were introducing has been reduced. The response to what actually happens becomes more precisely calibrated to what actually happens, rather than to what the complex is reading into what happens. And the relationship that is built on this kind of genuine and accurately calibrated emotional presence is, simply and without exaggeration, more real and more nourishing and more sustaining than any relationship that was possible before the work was done. Jung believed that the capacity for genuine love, for the kind of love that is genuinely given, rather than strategically offered to secure protection or validation, is not fully available to the person who is still primarily organized around the wound. Not because they do not love genuinely, but because a significant portion of what they experience as love is actually the complex seeking resolution, the wound seeking healing, the shadow seeking expression, through the medium of the relationship. When those needs have been genuinely addressed through the inner work rather than through the relationship is freed to be what it can most genuinely be. Two people genuinely present to each other, genuinely affected by each other, genuinely engaged in something that is mutual and real and capable of genuine development, rather than the endlessly repeated attempt to heal the old wound through the new person. This is what nobody and nothing hurting you again actually enables. Not the absence of love or connection or genuine engagement with the world and with other people, but love and connection and engagement of a quality that was not possible before. The quality that comes when you are genuinely there, when the protection is no longer the organizing principle, when the wound is no longer the silent authority on what can be risked and what must be protected, when you can give fully because you are no longer giving from a place of depletion and fear, but from a place that is, finally and genuinely yours. That is what Jung was pointing toward across the entire body of his work. A life genuinely inhabited, a self genuinely present, a love genuinely given, a connection genuinely made, in the full awareness that genuine connection always carries the possibility of genuine pain, and in the full experience of the inner stability that makes that possibility no longer a reason to hold back. Because you have done the work, because the wound has healed enough, because the center is solid enough, because nothing and nobody can reach it in the way they once did. Not because you have become less, but because you have, finally and genuinely, become more fully and more completely yourself.